The sound of vintage Bordeaux hitting white silk shouldn't have been that loud, yet it echoed through the Sterling ballroom like a gunshot. Silence followed, a heavy, suffocating silence that only 500 of London's most elite aristocrats could produce. At the center of the floor stood Lady Alara Vance, the quiet shadow of the Vance family, her gown ruined by a dark spreading stain that looked uncomfortably like blood. Standing over her was Lord Julian, the golden heir to the Earl of Marbury, a half-empty glass still in his hand and a smirk of practiced cruelty on his lips. "Forgive me, Alara," he said, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the gallery. "I forgot you were standing there. You've become so exceptionally good at being invisible these last 7 years, haven't you?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, a cruel, high-pitched tittering. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine, my fingers tightening around the cold silver of my cane. "I am the Duke of Ravenswood. In this city, my name is whispered with a mixture of awe and genuine terror, for I am the man who sees the rot beneath the gilding. Usually I find these social executions tedious, but as I looked down at Lady Alara, something felt wrong." She didn't flush. She didn't burst into tears. She didn't even look at her ruined dress. While the entire ton mocked her, she remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed not on her tormentor, but on the grandfather clock behind him. She wasn't a victim being humiliated. She was a predator waiting for a specific second to strike. Beside her, her own sister, the radiant Lady Clara, whispered loud enough for the duchesses to hear, "Oh, Alara, how clumsy. You've always been a stain on our father's reputation, but tonight you've truly outdone yourself." The injustice was palpable. A staged performance of cruelty meant to cast Alara out of society once and for all. But as our eyes met for a fleeting second, I saw it, a flash of cold, calculating intelligence that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Why was the most ignored woman in London intentionally provoking the most powerful families in England? What was she looking for in that clock? And why, after 7 years of silence, was she finally allowing them to see her, only to let them spit on her name? I realized then that the quiet shadow wasn't hiding from the world. She was waiting for the world to stop looking so she could finally begin her work. 7 years. That is how long the Vance family has kept Lady Alara in the periphery, a ghost in silk, a footnote in her own family's history. To the ton, the Earl of Vance is a pillar of virtue, and Lady Clara is his radiant, true heir. They see a grieving widower and a fragile older sister who simply couldn't handle the world after her mother's passing. But I have a mind like a steel trap. I remember the day the light went out of Alara's life. 7 years ago, the Countess Vance died under a cloud of whispers that the Earl's heavy purse silenced far too quickly. Since that day, Alara, once the sharpest wit in Mayfair, became a shadow. I watched the Earl parade Clara like a prize horse, while Alara was relegated to the corners, tasked with mending her sister's reputation. "She's a bit dim-witted now, isn't she?" I overheard Julian Marbury sneer seasons ago. But when I looked at her, she wasn't rattled. She was watching Julian with the cold, detached interest of a scientist examining a repulsive insect. The Vance household is a tomb of secrets. The Earl treats Clara like a queen, and Alara like furniture he keeps forgetting to dust. Yet I noticed the cracks, the Earl's hand shaking whenever Alara entered a room, Clara refusing to meet her sister's eyes in the dark. Then came the Marbury alliance. Julian is a man of violent appetites and a vanishing inheritance. The Earl didn't just offer a dowry. He offered a fortune so suspiciously large, it looked like a bribe. He wasn't buying a son-in-law. He was buying a powerful ally to keep something buried. Tonight, as the red wine dripped from Alara's hem, the illusion finally shattered. The Vance family spent 7 years convincing the world Alara was a broken liability. They used her as a vessel for their collective shame. But as the Earl looked at his eldest daughter tonight, I saw no disappointment. I saw naked, primal fear. The Vance family was a house of cards, and Alara wasn't the weakest card. She was the one holding the match. The laughter in the ballroom began to die down, not out of pity but out of a sudden, chilling realization that Lady Alara Vance was not moving. Most women in her position, publicly shamed, physically marked by wine, would have fled the room in a storm of taffeta and tears. Alara did neither. She stood as still as a marble monument in a graveyard. I stepped forward, the rhythmic thud of my cane on the parquet floor drawing every eye. I didn't look at Julian, that gilded parasite. I looked at the Earl of Vance. He wasn't looking at the wine on his daughter's dress. He was staring at her clenched right hand with an expression that wasn't embarrassment. It was pure, unadulterated terror. "Vance," I said, my voice cutting through the remaining whispers like a blade. "Your daughter seems to have had a mishap. Surely as a father so devoted to his family's honor, you'll see her to her carriage." The Earl jumped as if I'd fired a pistol next to his ear. Yes, of course, Ravenswood. A clumsy girl, always has been. Clara, dear, help your sister. Get her out of the light. Here was the first contradiction. Clara, the golden daughter, reached for Alara's arm. But as she leaned in, I saw her face drop the mask of sisterly concern. Her eyes were fixed on Alara's neck, searching for something. When she didn't find it, her features twisted into a mask of such visceral hatred that even Julian Marbury recoiled an inch. "Give it back," Clara hissed, her voice a low vibration only those of us within a few feet could hear. Alara tilted her head, a slow, predatory movement. "Give what back, Clara? The reputation you stole, or the mother you let rot in that drafty north wing while you danced?" The air in the room seemed to vanish. Clara's hand flew to her own throat, her face pale. This wasn't the dialogue of a dim-witted shadow. This was a direct strike. The Earl stepped between them, his voice rising in a defensive snarl. "That's enough. Alara is unwell, as you all know. The grief has clouded her mind again. Julian, take Clara to the gardens. I will handle this embarrassment." "Handle her?" I challenged, stepping into the Earl's path. "She's a lady of the realm, Vance, not a hound to be kennelled. Tell me, why does the mention of your late wife make you sweat in a room this cold?" "My wife's death was a tragedy, Ravenswood, one that is none of your business," he snapped, his composure finally shattering. His defensiveness was a confession in itself. A man with a clear conscience doesn't bark at a duke. He sighs with the weight of the truth. I watched as the Earl grabbed Alara's arm, not to guide her, but to restrain her. But as he pulled her toward the exit, Alara's fingers brushed against the mahogany table holding the punch bowl. With a deliberate, almost surgical precision, she let a small object slip from her ruined sleeve. It fell silently onto the velvet runner. I moved before the servants could, my cane pinning the object to the floor. When the Earl and his daughters were gone, I reached down and retrieved it. It wasn't a jewel. It wasn't a love letter. It was a heavy, blackened silver key. Engraved on the bow was the crest of the Lombard and Thorn Bank, a prestigious institution that had burned to the ground and declared bankruptcy exactly 7 years ago, the very week the Countess Vance had died. The official record said the bank's ledgers were destroyed in the fire, taking the Vance family's original fortune with them. But the key in my hand was cold, solid, and very much intact. If the bank was gone, what door did this still open? And why had Alara Vance spent 7 years pretending to be a ghost just to hand it to me tonight? "A moment, Vance," I said, the blackened silver key resting openly in my palm. The Earl froze. Lady Clara, wrapped in a fur stole that cost more than a village, stared at the key. Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition she couldn't hide. It wasn't just fear. It was the look of a conspirator seeing the evidence of a crime. "I found this," I continued, my voice low but carrying with the resonant authority of my station. "A curious relic, wouldn't you say? Especially since Lombard and Thorn Bank supposedly burned to the ground 7 years ago. The fire was said to be absolute, yet this key bears the mark of the private vaults, the ones located in the sub-basement, the only part of the bank that survived the flames." A collective gasp went up from the gathered nobles. In London, money is the only thing more sacred than blood. If the Vance fortune hadn't been lost, If the Earl had claimed the insurance while secretly keeping the assets, it wasn't just a scandal, it was a hanging offense. "It's a trinket, Ravenswood, a memento of a lost fortune," the Earl roared, reaching for it with trembling fingers. I closed my hand. "Don't listen to him," Clara suddenly shrieked, her voice cracking the elegant atmosphere. "My father has done nothing but provide for us since our mother died of her weakness." "Weakness?" Alara's voice cut through her sister's hysteria. She stepped out from the shadows, her ruined dress still dripping wine onto the marble floor. For the first time in 7 years, she stood tall, her gaze sweeping over the room with chilling disdain. "Is that what we're calling it now, Clara? Mother didn't have a weakness. She had a ledger, and she had the only other key." The air in the foyer seemed to vanish. I watched the Earl's face go from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. "I wasn't locked in, Father," Alara whispered, loud enough for every duchess to hear. "I was watching. I watched you move the crates at midnight. I watched you and Clara burn Mother's letters. You didn't just lose my inheritance, you stole it to buy Clara's way into society." The room went deathly silent. This was the partial truth, a father robbing his own child. But as the socialites began to murmur, sensing blood, I looked at Alara. She wasn't satisfied. "The money was never the secret," she said, looking directly at me. "The question you should be asking, Your Grace, is, what was my mother about to tell the bank directors the morning she, coincidentally, died?" Before I could answer, the front doors burst open. A mud-spattered courier from the Admiralty pushed through, holding a sealed black envelope. He didn't look for the host, he looked for me. "Your Grace," he panted, "the wreckage of the Countess Vance, the ship your family invested in 7 years ago, has been found. It didn't sink in a storm, it was scuttled, from the inside." I felt the world tilt. My family's greatest loss and Alara's mother's death were tied to the same moment. And the man holding the key to both was currently standing 3 feet away from me, looking at his daughter with the eyes of a murderer. The silence that followed the courier's announcement was a vacuum before an explosion. My heart, usually a cold organ of calculation, hammered against my ribs. My father had been on that ship. The Countess Vance had been his final investment. When it sank, my family's wealth vanished, and the Countess Vance followed her ship to the grave within a week. I looked at the Earl. He wasn't just pale. He was translucent, watching his executioner sharpen the blade. "The ship was scuttled," I repeated, my voice dropping to the low growl that makes ministers tremble, "which means it was murdered, just like the bank, and just like your wife, Vance, who died of a weakness that only appeared when the accounts were called for." "This is madness," the Earl cried, his voice echoing off the marble ceilings. "Guards, remove this man. He is slandering a peer of the realm." But no one moved. The guests, the highest-ranking vultures in England, didn't step back in horror. They stepped forward. They smelled the blood of a fallen giant. I saw the Duchess of Marlborough lean in, her eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. I didn't need guards. I had the social climate. I had turned the ballroom into a courtroom. "Julian," I said, turning to the golden heir, "does your father know your future father-in-law is a man whose hands are stained with salt water and blood? Or perhaps the dowry was simply the price for your silence?" Julian's face went from gold to ash. He looked at Clara, who was trembling so violently her diamond necklace rattled. He saw the social ruin reflected in my eyes and did what all parasites do. He detached. "I knew nothing of this," Julian spat, stepping away from Clara. "If this is true, the engagement is a mockery." "Julian, no!" Clara gasped, reaching for him. He brushed her hand away with a look of pure disgust. The golden couple had lasted less than a minute under the heat of the truth. I turned back to Alara. She was watching her sister's world crumble with a terrifyingly serene expression. "Alara," I said softly, "you knew the courier was coming. You didn't spill that wine by accident. You timed it all to this moment." "I've spent 7 years being a piece of furniture, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "People sign death warrants in front of furniture. They hide stolen ledgers behind portraits in their studies. They forget that even the shadows have ears." You traitorous viper!" the Earl hissed, lunging toward her. 3 noblemen immediately stepped in his way, blocking his path. "The study?" I asked, sensing the final blow. "The study," she confirmed, glancing at the grandfather clock. "But my father is a man of habit. He thinks hiding the truth behind my mother's portrait makes it safe." The Earl's eyes darted toward the hallway, a mad glint appearing. 3, 2, 1, Ilara whispered. A dull thump echoed through the house, followed by the smell of smoke. The Earl began to laugh, a high, jagged sound. "The ledger is gone, Ravenswood, and she's the one who set the fuse. You have no proof left." The smoke drifting from the study wasn't the thick, oily reek of burning ledgers. It was light, scented with the dried lavender my mother used to favor. I looked at the Earl, whose triumphant laughter was already beginning to sour into a mask of confusion. "You fool," Ilara whispered, her voice slicing through the panicked murmurs of the duchesses and the stiff-collared lords. "Do you truly think I would leave the only evidence of my mother's murder in a place you could reach?" The Earl stumbled toward the study, but the heat was already blooming behind the mahogany doors. "The ledger! I saw it. I saw the black binding behind the portrait." "You saw a decoy, Father. A collection of your own gambling debts and forged signatures, soaked in oil and set to a slow-burning fuse." Ilara stepped forward, her ruined silk gown trailing behind her like the robes of an empress. She reached into the hidden folds of her skirt and pulled out a small, leather-bound volume, untouched, pristine, and ancient. "This is the Lombard ledger, the one Mother died for. The one that proves you didn't just scuttle the Countess Vance. You sold the coordinates of 3 other crown ships to privateers to cover your losses at the tables." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of 500 reputations holding their breath. In the world of the ton, debt is a scandal, and theft is a crime. But treason is an erasure. I looked at the Earl. He seemed to shrink, the very fabric of his noble stature dissolving before our eyes. The Marquis of Hertford stepped back from him, as if he were made of ash. Lady Clara, the golden daughter, let out a choked sob and collapsed onto a settee, her social life ending in a pathetic heap of lace. No one went to her, not even Julian, who was already halfway to the exit, his eyes darting around like a rat in a flooding cellar. "You said she was at the harbor," I said, my voice echoing in the hollow silence of the foyer. "You said she held the lantern." Ilara turned to me, her eyes shimmering with 7 years of suppressed fire. "I did hold the lantern, Your Grace, but not for the men with the drills. I held it so I could see the faces of the men my father paid. I held it so I could write down their names. I was 17, alone and watching my world sink. I knew that if I spoke then, I would end up at the bottom of the Thames. So I waited." She looked back at the Earl, who was now on his knees, staring at the smoke billowing from his sanctuary. "I waited for 7 years," she continued, her voice gaining a terrifying resonance. "I played the fool. I played the shadow. I let you humiliate me, let Clara mock me, and let the world forget I existed. I waited until the only man in England powerful enough to bypass your bought and paid-for magistrates, the Duke of Ravenswood, was in this room." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The wine on the dress, the clumsy fall, the key, it was all a lure. She hadn't been saved by my intervention. She had orchestrated it. She had chosen me to be her executioner because she knew I had the same blood feud with her father that she did. "The Admiralty is not just here for a report, Vance," I said, looking down at the broken man. "They are here for you." As if on cue, the mud-spattered courier stepped aside, and 4 men in the dark blue uniform of the High Court stepped into the light. The lead officer didn't look at the smoke. He looked at the ledger in Ilara's hand. "Lady Ilara Vance?" he asked. "I am," she said, her posture perfect. "And this is the evidence you were promised 7 years ago. My father is the man you seek. My sister is his accomplice in the destruction of my mother's final letters." The officers moved with cold, professional efficiency. As they hoisted the Earl to his feet, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. There were no words of comfort, no calls for mercy. The Vance name was being scrubbed from the ledgers of London in real time. Clara tried to reach for the Marquis's hand as they led her father past, but the old man drew his coat tight, refusing even the contact of her shadow. The social hierarchy had inverted. The quiet shadow was the only person in the room standing in the light. I walked toward her, the rhythmic clack of my cane the only sound left in the house. The elite of England watched us, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. They realized, as I did, that the woman they had spent 7 years ignoring was now the most dangerous person in the room. I reached her, looking down at the wine stain on her white silk. It no longer looked like a mark of clumsiness. It looked like a badge of war. "The ballroom is empty, Lady Alara," I said, offering my arm, "and your father's house is burning. Shall we find a place more suited for a woman of your talents?" She looked at my arm, then at me. For the first time, the coldness in her eyes flickered with a genuine spark of something human. She didn't take my arm like a debutante seeking protection. She took it like an ally. "The world will say you rescued me tonight, Your Grace," she whispered as we began to walk toward the grand doors, leaving the ruins of her family behind. "Let them say what they wish," I replied, my voice carrying to the ears of every gossip-monger in the hall. "But we both know the truth. You didn't need a savior. You just needed a witness." And as England's most feared duke led the quiet shadow out into the night, the silence of the Tun followed us, a silence that wouldn't be broken for a long, long time. By the following dawn, the name Vance was being scrubbed from every invitation list in Mayfair with the frantic energy of a surgeon removing a gangrene limb. The Earl was moved from the Admiralty holding cells to the Tower, facing charges of high treason that carried the weight of the noose. Lady Clara, the Golden Daughter, vanished into a shuttered cottage in the north, her beauty now a scarlet letter in a world that prizes loyalty above all. London is a city built on whispers, but today they only whispered one name, Ilara. I sat across from her in my private carriage as we crossed the Serpentine. The blackened silver key rested on the velvet seat between us, a heavy, silent witness to the night's carnage. She was no longer wearing ruined silk. She wore midnight blue, a color that didn't hide her in the shadows, but announced her as the mistress of them. "They are terrified of you, you know," I remarked, watching the way she looked at the passing city. "The duchesses are already debating whether to bow to you or flee the room when you enter. You've become the most dangerous woman in England overnight." Ilara turned her gaze toward me, and for the first time in 7 years, I saw no exhaustion in her eyes, only a cold, crystalline clarity. "Let them be terrified, Your Grace. It is a far more useful emotion than pity. For 7 years, I was a ghost. Now I am the one who haunts their secrets." She had lost a mother and a home, but she had reclaimed a legacy built on the truth. I realized then that my own reputation, the feared Duke of Ravenswood, had finally found its equal. As the carriage slowed before the gates of her mother's ancestral estate, now legally hers, she paused with her hand on the silver latch. "You once asked why I waited 7 years, Ravenswood." "I did." "Because," she whispered, a small, lethal smile touching her lips, "the world only stops watching you when they think you've been defeated, and it is only when the world stops watching that you can truly see everything." I watched her walk toward the manor, the quiet shadow finally stepping into a sun that she had earned. London would never be the same, for the Tun had learned a bitter lesson. Never mistake a woman's silence for her surrender, for a predator only stays quiet when she is calculating the exact depth of your throat.